Hello and welcome to Broken Entertainment. So I finally decided I'm gonna read Game of Thrones, the book, not the TV show, obviously, and I'm not referring to the series of books as Game of Thrones. I was gonna read the book, Game of Thrones, and the reason I did that, there's actually a couple of reasons. Because I've done previous videos on George R. R. Martin talking about, his books not being done. Does he owe his fans the completion of his series and so on? And, I thought if I'm going to keep talking about this guy, I should at least read something of his. Plus, I'm a writer. I'm moving now rather rapidly towards publication. And it's always good to try to learn from the people who have come before you and the people who are writing still in your genre in particular and elsewhere. And I've had people say, oh, you don't need to learn from him because he doesn't fit your style and so on. And that's true. George R. R. Martin's style and my style are two very different things, but there's always something you can learn from any given author. And that was certainly true when I went ahead and listened to A Game of Thrones. There were some things I said, I could use, I could do this. I could kind of adjust my writing, take note of how he structures this and how he structured this kind of scene. I could use, these skill sets, right? Not steal particular scenes or anything like that, but use skill sets and use, okay, he uses a lot of food, and I thought, I really almost never cover that, and it's actually pretty important because food takes up a large part of our life, right? You eat breakfast, you eat lunch, you eat dinner, you have snacks. And the same is true of fictional characters. They're living in a world and they're doing the things that require to keep biology moving. So that's got to play a role. And you can tell sort of soft world building through showing food. All right, so I'll use an example in my writing. There is a scene in the fantasy novel that I'm writing where some characters end up in the far, far north, and there's a city-state up there, and they go and they're being dined, and they are served, among other things, seal, because of where they are. But the seals of this world are vicious, violent, weirdly elongated, huge creatures, for reasons that are apparent in the novel and I'm not going to go into here. So it says something about the seal because they're introduced to that. It tells you something about that culture because they hunt something like that for their meat. Okay? And it's these little snippets of life that you're able to use to show world building without going into big mountains of exposition. The reason I had avoided reading A Game of Thrones before, and I did not watch the TV show, was because it's very, very dark. And to me, it's fine to plunge a world and characters into darkness, but I like them to come out of it at some point. And Game of Thrones just wallows in it. They never come out of it, right? So I knew, I'm like, ultimately, I'm not really going to like it that much. And the other reason I decided to go ahead and listen to it was I am struggling to find modern fantasy, and by modern I mean anything written from 2000 on, that's really good and entertaining. A lot of it is very political. A lot of it tries to check off certain boxes. And, an example, I'm not going to name the book, but I'm listening to this book that I tried to listen to. It was written relatively recently. And I realized they were being political with their use of language. Because they were intentionally phrasing, when you would normally say men and women, they were intentionally saying women and men. And it seems like a minor thing. But they started saying it like it came up an unbelievably weird number of times. And I've seen it in another book before this one, and I really liked it in that book because it was specifically world building a matriarchal society. So a matriarchal society, that makes sense. And he only used it, the author only used it sparingly. And you don't, when you think about it, how often do you say the phrase men and women? Not all that often. It doesn't come up. You say people or something like that. It's just simpler, it's shorter. But this book was using it a weird number of times. And then they started talking about the emperor. And I'm like, okay, so there's an emperor, so it's an empire, got it. And they were referring to the emperor as a she. I'm like, there is a word for a female emperor. It's called an empress. And I'm like, so you're using this gendered language for a purpose that isn't world building, because the world didn't really reflect that like the other book, which is Rage of Dragons, did. So I put it down. I'm like, I am not interested in politicizing things. I'm not interested in being lectured to. I'm not interested in these weird, we're going to try and push gender ideology or this ideology or that ideology. I just want to be entertained. I'm like, okay. So then I couldn't find anything. So I'm like, you know what? At the same time, I'm watching House of the Dragon. And I'm watching House of the Dragon for exactly the same reason. Because I was like, there's no TV show. I'm sitting there watching a show, and I think it was Batman the Animated Series. I'm like, God, everything I watch is from 20 years ago. And I'm like, I got it. That's it. I'm sitting down, and I'm going to force myself to watch something not from 20 years ago. So I picked House of the Dragon, and ended up really liking it. So I'm like, you know what? I liked House of the Dragon. Let's give the Game of Thrones book a shot. So download the audiobook, and let me start by saying the narrator for A Game of Thrones is fantastic. And I know he's not alive anymore. I forget his name off the top of my head, but wonderful job. In the first book, Game of Thrones, I thought about doing a full review. This video actually started out was going to be a review, but we're going to go a different path. I started out on like, this is a decent book. I was enjoying it, and at the end of it, I had relatively enjoyed it enough that I said, all right, we'll start with Clash of Kings. Now, I did not finish Clash of Kings, because that's where we're getting into the wallowing into darkness more, I thought, than Game of Thrones. And it brings up the question. George R. R. Martin is very, very popular. My videos on him always get a lot of views. Sometimes they get a lot of angry George R. R. Martin fans, because I'm not always flattering to the guy. And so I'm thinking, what is his legacy going to be? Okay, you have the Game of Thrones show that ended very badly and pissed a lot of people off, but then you have House of the Dragons, which ended up doing very well. And then you have his books, which aren't finished. We know that he is relatively 2/3 of the way through Winds of Winter. After that, he has to do Dream of Spring. And he's writing all these other books in between. And the man's in his 70s. The math is not favorable there, especially when it's taken 12 years to do Winds of Winter. So, I'm not saying the guy's going to die tomorrow. I'm not saying I want him to die. I certainly don't. But being realistic, there's a real solid chance that the Song of Ice and Fire does not get finished. We've seen that before with the Wheel of Time. The author died before he could finish it, but he selected somebody, Brandon Sanderson, to finish it for him. So this brings the question, what is his legacy? If George R. R. Martin finishes Winds of Winter, or not, doesn't matter. But let's say he does not finish the Song of Ice and Fire books. Where does that put his legacy? Does he have one? Does his legacy get carried by the TV shows? And I'm thinking about this, and you know, at first I'm like, well, if he doesn't finish the books, what legacy? But the interesting thing is that he's been writing these books for decades. And he has one show that was very popular for a while, and one show that is doing very well. And it reminded me of Star Trek: The Original Series. Star Trek: The Original Series was on for 3 seasons. And look what has spawned out of that. And that didn't happen right away. It took another, I think it was about 20 years before we got The Next Generation and everything that came out of that. But in those 3 seasons, you got a whole bunch of scientists and writers who were inspired, and TV show creators who were inspired by 3 years of content that were, in essence, incompleted. The show got canceled. So if Star Trek can inspire a bunch of scientists and a bunch of writers and TV show directors and movie directors, does A Song of Ice and Fire have to be finished for George R. R. Martin to have an impact? Which is why this video is really about the impact that A Song of Ice and Fire is going to have on the genre of fantasy. Now, the interesting thing right now about A Song of Ice and Fire is you cannot talk about fantasy without George R. R. Martin's name coming up. That's a big deal. And he's been writing these books for a long time. We know he has a lot of fans. I think he does not have to finish A Song of Ice and Fire to have significant impact on the fantasy genre. You already see books coming out by new authors, and people say, this is the Game of Thrones of blah, blah, blah. This is like Game of Thrones. This is Game of Thrones, but with dinosaurs. That's an actual book, by the way. There's a book with a blurb on it that says Game of Thrones, but with dinosaurs. That's called The Dinosaur Lords. Haven't read it. I do own it. I should actually read it at some point. So that already tells you something. If people are already saying, this is the Game of Thrones of, the impact might already be there. And now the question becomes how significant and how lasting is that impact. I think when you consider how long he's been writing, that impact is probably substantial and probably lasting without finishing the book. Now, I think that A Song of Ice and Fire incomplete does not become multi-generational. I don't think you can have an incomplete series become multi-generational in book form. Now, Star Trek did, but not really, because the reason Star Trek is still around is the Next Generation. Okay, in the movies. And the Next Generation comes from Gene Roddenberry and the fans being excited, but those were the same fans in that 20-year span. And those were the same fans in the films, and those were the same fans, more or less, through to Voyager. And you have a declining fan base of Star Trek starting around Voyager and moving on. You got some new people, but it's not having that. When people talk science fiction, do they talk Star Trek? Sometimes, yes. But it's not inherently multi-generational. Doctor Who was, because it was on for so long. But Star Trek really doesn't become potentially multi-generational until you have the renewal of the show, in essence, in the form of the Next Generation and its subsequent spin-offs. If you just take the 3 years of Star Trek, it is not multi-generational. Not substantially multi-generational. I know there are fans who were not alive then, and you're going, well, that's multi-generational because I'm from... Look, it's just not in substantial numbers. I think if you take away the next generation, it dies off. A lot of people that are fans of the original series are fans of the original series because they watched it with their parents. Or because they watched the next generation and then went back and watched the original series. Talking about that second generation of fans. But it took that next step. So the question becomes, is it multi-generational? Can it be multi-generational? Well, let's talk about the multi-generational fantasy books. And the first and foremost among those, of course, is Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Lord of the Rings is a finished book series. And it has stood the test of time over and over and over and over again, inspiring countless writers, including George R. R. Martin. But it was completed. Now, I have a list here on the screen of the highest selling fantasy novels of all time. And it counts up. Okay, so we're going to start at the bottom. The Shadowhunter Chronicles, which I've never heard of before. It's the Mortal Instruments. Okay. Around 36 million copies. That's decent. No impact whatsoever, I think, on the genre, but Vampire Chronicles, 80 million. That's Anne Rice. That had a big impact for a while, but I don't really hear a lot of people talk about it anymore. Discworld, that's still very popular, about 80 million copies. The Wheel of Time, 90 million copies. You cannot talk about modern fantasy and not talk about The Wheel of Time. It is, I think, not even arguably, I think it is the most influential work of fantasy after Lord of the Rings. By the way, they're using TV show pictures because this is Screen Rant. A Song of Ice and Fire, about 90 million copies, so tied with The Wheel of Time. So it's pretty high up this list, and it's about tied with The Wheel of Time. But the difference between the two is that A Song of Ice and Fire is not finished, and it has inspired a bunch of people. I'm willing to bet, we don't have numbers on that, but I'd be shocked if it hadn't at this point, inspired a bunch of writers to write fantasy. And we see it talked about all the time when you talk about fantasy. The problem is, how do you get somebody into it 20 years from now? Oh, hey, there's this really influential author on fantasy. He inspired this guy and this guy. He was named George R. R. Martin. He wrote A Song of Ice and Fire. But it's not done. It is a statistical fact that many readers, even most readers, will not pick up a series until it is done. Authors fight that all the time. They're writing a trilogy, they're writing a 6-book series, and they have hard time selling it until that last book is done because people don't want to pick up a series that does not finish. 20 years from now, that's not going to be any different. And how do you get a new fan into it then? That's why I say I don't think an incomplete Song of Ice and Fire becomes multi-generational. And I'll put a caveat on that. Unless the TV shows are popular, well-written, and around long enough to make up for it. We'll see. It has a lot of work to do. House of the Dragon certainly helped. But those TV shows have their own legacy to deal with. And it's a negative one. And they have to increase significantly in popularity to be able to bridge that gap of, well, the fantasy series isn't complete, but you can read the original books, and then you can go watch these awesome TV shows, and then you get the fans. Now, who else is on this list? We have the Chronicles of Narnia at 100 million. Percy Jackson and the Olympians. I can't believe that is that high. That is crazy. 180 million. Twilight, sadly, at 250 million. And really, you're going to call it the Middle Earth Saga? Oh, come on. Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, 250 million. And, of course, Harry Potter. Now, aside from A Song of Ice and Fire, you cannot get away from any of these. And they have fans, and they continue to have fans, and they continue to gain fans. Chronicles of Narnia is old. Lord of the Rings, written in the 50s. The Wheel of Time, written, I think, in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken. I don't believe that an incomplete Song of Ice and Fire maintains a prolonged, lasting impact on the fantasy genre. I do think a completed Song of Ice and Fire will rank right up there with Lord of the Rings and the Wheel of Time in terms of impact on the fantasy genre and importance and legacy. But without a completed story, it's a hard sell for new people. Now, can the TV show bridge that gap? That is the unique scenario. Song of Ice and Fire has, these other books don't. And brings you into that Star Trek territory we talked about earlier, where I said, it wasn't really until the Next Generation came around. Well, in this case, it would be not really until the TV shows got really popular and long-lasting. And I'm not harping on George R. R. Martin. I think he's a good author. I just think he can't last. His legacy can't last past a generation without a completed book series. That being said, I do think he's had a significant impact on this generation. Not as significant as Harry Potter, which a lot of people will be sad to hear, but Harry Potter is, 500 million copies. It's far and away sold more books than any of these series. And basically, I think you could add them all together. Simply the best selling and the most popular with the largest number of people, where you don't even have to talk about the fantasy genre. Now, the interesting thing is, what is the impact of Harry Potter on fantasy? And I think that's a topic for another video, because I'm not sure its impact is as significant. Twilight, as these numbers suggest. But I'll do another video on that at some point, because that's a whole other ball of cheese. I'm very curious to see what you people think about his legacy. Can it last without finishing the books? What is it without finishing the books? I think it's significant now. I just don't know that it can keep going. And I do think it has inspired a lot of writers. I do. It hasn't inspired me. My inspiration comes from Lord of the Rings. It comes from a Stormlight Archive. It comes from Anne McCaffrey's Pern series. But I understand why people are inspired by him. I understand why when you read the covers of fantasy books now, they say the Game of Thrones of. I understand that. And I'm rooting for him to finish the series, because I think it would be a damn shame to have something that has sold to date 90 million copies eventually flutter away and become just another fantasy series that wasn't completed. Because I don't know how you get new fans over time by telling them, hey, here's this cool story, by the way, there's no ending. So a lot could hang on the TV show. Let me know what you think of all this. If you think this has a significant impact, if you think George R. R. Martin's legacy will stick around if he doesn't finish the books. Let me know what you think of House of the Dragon. I really enjoyed it. It had some flaws, but I thought it was a really good series. So if you are not subscribed, please consider subscribing. If you like the video, please hit the like button, and I will see you next time.